Welcome back to the channel, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I'm going to be doing a video which honestly, I never thought I was gonna ever do, and that is, what if Deku was a ghoul? The reason I never wanted to make this video is because honestly, I thought he was a weak power, but as I started thinking of a way to actually pull this off, I found the perfect way to scale Deku to this universe and make him one of the strongest characters. So I truly do hope you guys enjoy this version of what if Deku was a ghoul, and you leave a like, seeing as I might be more inclined to make more of these types of videos if this one performs very well. That said, enjoy. We begin our story with Izuku packing his things, getting ready to leave class. That's when Bakugo and his goons would capture Izuku, telling him that he's got a whole lot of nerve for trying to sign up to UA. His friends in the back simply scoffing, saying that there's no way he's gonna get in, but Bakugo, he's already in. This is when Kacchan burns up Izuku's book and then proceeds to tell him that, there is a way he could get a quirk. Going on to say that if he was to take a swan dive off the roof, then maybe he'll be reborn with a quirk in his next life. It's here that unlike the original, Izuku doesn't even retaliate whatsoever, not making a face or anything, simply looking down at the ground downcast. As Bakugo and his goons would leave, one of them would echo, "That was kinda harsh, don't you think, Bakugo?" To which he would say, "Nah, the frickin' loser needs to know his place. He thinks he can play hero while having no quirk. I actually just saved his life." And as Izuku could hear the sounds of the footsteps growing farther and farther, Izuku grabs his things and makes his way to the top of the building. It's here that Izuku would scream out, "Sorta like this, Kacchan!" before leaping off the building, literally doing exactly what Bakugo had said. Izuku had grown tired of life, tired of his weakness, and tired of being treated differently for his quirklessness. So you know what? He'll take his advice, and he'll hope he will be reborn with a quirk in his next life. It's here that as Izuku would leap off the building, regret would instantly fill Izuku's heart. And as Bakugo would watch the boy jump off, instantly he would shoot off with his quirk, using his explosions to try to save him, screaming out, "Deku!" before the chilling sound of a thud would be heard, and Izuku's blood would splatter over the concrete. As Bakugo would look at his dead body, his eyes would widen, Bakugo beginning to take a few steps back, saying that he didn't mean to. When did this? Ow! He would think, as his two goons looking at him would say, "Is he dead?" And Bakugo checking for a pulse would feel nothing. It's here that Bakugo turning to both of them, realizing that if this gets out there, his hero career's done, he would say not a word of this to anyone, before all of them would sprint off in different directions, acting as though nothing had even happened, or at least, that's what they would try to do. But Bakugo couldn't help but get it out of his mind that it was his fault. He told them to kill himself, and Izuku probably did it because he told him to. He said he'd be reborn with a quirk in his next life. Then he would remember the last words he ever heard from him. "Like this, Kacchan!" before the sound of the thud would be heard, and Bakugo couldn't do a thing to save him. He had killed somebody. Some hero he was, he would think. But as this would happen, back where the dead body of Izuku was, would be the misty form of Kurogiri, having warped the dead boy away to Dr. Ujiko's office, seeing as this was the perfect candidate to be turned into a Nomu. And since Dr. Ujiko had never done anything like this on a quirkless human before, it was going to be pretty interesting to find out what kind of quirk he had. So as he would run some tests on the dead boy, he would find out that this boy, he was quirkless. The doctor would scream, "He's quirkless!" All for One's gonna be so excited to see what this new Nomu creature could do. Before the doctor would then proceed to conduct experiments on the boy's dead flesh and then add a multitude of quirks to him. Beginning with the regeneration quirk that allowed him to have unnatural healing. Second, he added a strange quirk that he had found from a no-good street thug, essentially a Kagane. And after that quirk would be added to the boy's body, the boy would strengthen. The doctor, fascinated by the reaction of this quirkless specimen. Then he would add a speed quirk, an enhancement quirk, a durability quirk, and finally, a quirk that would enhance all of his senses. His Nomu would be done, and as the doctor would take a few steps back to look at his newest creation, he would notice that the nomification process had altered his hair color. "Interesting. Very interesting. The way this quirkless specimen's reacting to the quirks is unlike anything I've ever seen," the doctor would say, looking at his proudest creation, telling All for One all about it, about how they should actually start using the dead corpses of quirkless people, All for One having a smile grow on his face as he would say that it's an interesting idea, and maybe they could do that. It's here that the call would end, and as this would happen, the doctor, wanting to test his newest creation's durability, would proceed to wake it up, tying it down to a chair just in case, before then proceeding to use a multitude of tools to inflict pain to see just how good the durability and regeneration is. The first tool he would use would be a sander, using 5,000 grit sandpaper to sand down Izuku's thigh. Izuku making a screeching noise as the doctor would say, "Marvelous, marvelous, you're healing greatly," before then reaching towards the direction of a screwdriver and stabbing it straight through the leg. He would see this is incredible, noting that it hadn't even stabbed through. This is when the doctor would have a wicked smile appear on his face as he would grab a tub of literal poisonous bugs that should kill the average human with one sting, and then proceed to throw it onto Izuku's body, the bugs crawling all throughout inside of it, a centipede literally going inside of his ear, the Nomu simply staying still as Izuku would go, "Ah!" while the doctor would watch on. "Fascinating, he's even resisting the poison. This is incredible. He may even perform better than the Nomu that I have created to kill All Might. All for One's gonna be very proud." This is when the doctor would waken a different Nomu to mutilate Deku. It would start ripping out tendons to see how long the regeneration process takes, and then start ripping off fingers one by one, ripping out the boy's nails and tearing deep into his bones, Izuku regenerating each and every single time. As these blows would be inflicted, slowly, the pain would start to cause Izuku's mind to naturally start waking back up, almost as if he was a defrosted fish that somehow managed to survive. Izuku's eyes would open, black with red pupils. As Izuku staring at the doctor, rage filling his eyes, he would tear out of the chair that was supposed to hold him down, as instantly mutilating the Nomu that had caused him pain. Izuku would then turn his attentions towards the doctor, telling him that it's about time he shows him what it's like to be on the other end, having gone a little loony from all the torture, from barely having woken up, and from literally having his nature being changed. Izuku was turned into a ghoul via these experiments, and Izuku was hungry. So it's at this point that Izuku would gnaw into the arm of Dr. Ujiko, him releasing a gut-wrenching scream as Izuku, biting into his flesh, would spit it out, calling it disgusting, voice sounding as though the dude had like a voice modulator on in that moment. It's here that the doctor would scream, "Master, please help me!" That suddenly, All for One would appear, stabbing tendrils straight through the body of Izuku, who was rampaging, sending the boy crashing into the wall as he would let out a gut-wrenching cry. It's here that All for One would shoot out more tendrils, and now they would stab into the body of Izuku. Izuku's eye would start twitching, Kagune now expanding, as he would tear off the tendrils of All for One, leaping towards the wall before using it to propel himself straight at the Demon Lord. He would put up a barrier quirk before telling him to calm down, shooting a propulsor quirk that would destroy a significantly large section of the lab. But as Izuku would take the blow, his body would instantly snap back into gear, him completely unable to take control of his body, the nomification process rotting his brain. This is when Izuku would lunge towards All for One once again, and as the 4 tendrils of his Kagune would come out, they would attack at the Demon Lord, attempting to shatter through the barrier. But noting that it didn't work, Izuku would then turn his attentions towards the doctor, lunging towards him as All for One would shoot out a massively powered blow, knocking the boy out. Him having ran at him with chains lunging behind him, about to have literally wrapped them around the doctor and bitten his throat clean off. This is when a now beaten and battered Izuku would lay on the ground screaming, "Damn you," as All for One would shoot more tendrils towards his body for safekeeping. It's at this point that he would tell the doctor to continue working on this thing and make sure it never loses control like that again. That this one is the one that they're going to be using for All Might. The regeneration, the toughness, the quickness, and dexterity are going to make him a monster to go up against. And with All Might not having the right tools to fight this thing, he thinks it just might be enough. As we would then see Zuko being placed back inside of the vat, with the doctor performing countless experiments on the boy. This would completely destroy any semblance of Izuku's personality, or so the doctor would think. And so with Izuku being finished and perfected, the doctor would show All for One that he obeys any command given to him by the doctor, All for One, and even Shigaraki, as we see the boy entering the room and saying, "So this is the thing that's gonna finally kill All Might. I'll believe it when I see it." Shigaraki exiting the room, with the doctor staring at Izuku saying that he is one of his very first high-end quirkless humans, and he's excited to see how he'll do against the symbol of peace, Arm now having been healed after being given a regeneration quirk from All for One, with us having a little bit of a time skip to the actual story. It's here that we zoom into Class 1A riding a bus towards the USJ that everybody would be speaking about who the strongest is. Monoma, who now would be part of Class 1A thanks to Izuku never having been part of the story, saying that he's the strongest, and whatever quirk somebody has, he'll just copy it and use it better. Bakugo screaming out, "Like hell you are, copycat," Bakugo would say, Todoroki staring at the direction of Monoma thinking that there's no way he could have better control than him with his quirk, so his spot's secured. Then the students would arrive as they would be given a speech by 13, and then chaos would ensue. Kurogiri warping in with all of the villains as Shigaraki would be near the bottom, Izuku standing right beside him looking as though he was a zombie, arms slanted down, hair covering his face. Izuku looked like a shell of his former self, so nobody could recognize him. And as the attack would ensue, and the students would suddenly start to be sent to different sections, all having to fight their own battles, this is when Aizawa, impressing Shigaraki, would lead the young boy to finally saying, "Nomu, kill him." Izuku finally looking up as he would lunge towards the direction of Aizawa, him having cancelled his quirk, so Izuku had zero access to his Kagune, and as the scarf would wrap around Izuku and he would attempt to bring him in for an attack, Izuku would grab onto the scarf, yanking Aizawa, shocking him by the speed and strength, before slamming his knee square into the face of Aizawa, breaking his nose, causing him to lose concentration. All four of his Kagune arms instantly coming out as they would pierce into the body of Aizawa. Izuku taking the liberty to take a chomp straight out of Aizawa in that moment, and as Aizawa would fall down to the ground, blood pouring out, Izuku would stand still, having been giving no other directives. It's at this point that the students Tsuyu, Monoma, and Mineta would watch on in horror, that we would see Shigaraki noticing them and saying, "Hey Nomu, why don't you go take care of these kids as well?" And as Izuku would lunge towards their direction, Kagune about to pierce into the heart of Tsuyu, All Might would stand there, having punched Izuku backwards, sending him flying, his arm breaking and leg shattering from the inside, before spinning back together and regenerating almost instantly. It's here that Izuku staring up at All Might would have one of his eyes turn back to normal, as he would say, All Might, help." But due to Izuku having the nullification process controlling him, it would barely be audible. Izuku would then lunge back in towards the direction of All Might, slamming his fist onto the ground, causing a crater to be formed, before then throwing a low-rise uppercut towards the direction of All Might, who would parry and throw a punch straight at Izuku's stomach, which normally would send him flying back, if not for Izuku's Kagune latching onto All Might's arm in the last second, spinning him into the air before landing before him in an attempt to strike him at all four spots. All Might would be capable of grabbing 3 of them, but one would damage All Might square in his weak spot, piercing it as blood would begin pouring out of the mouth of All Might, as we would then see a pillar of ice go shooting towards him. This would freeze him instantly breaking out of it using his Kagune, as Izuku's body would rapidly heal. This is when Izuku could hear the sounds of explosions getting closer, and as Izuku would turn, eye locking onto Bakugo, this is when unresolved anger would cause Izuku to go back into his crazed state, as Izuku instantly using his Kagune would pierce into the side of Bakugo, throwing him down onto the ground like he was garbage, ice flying towards him, Izuku swiping his arm and crushing it instantly, All Might rushing towards him and sending a punch at his ribs, which would send him flying. All Might not even giving him a second to breathe, back on him in an instant, landing about 50 blows in a second. That is until his Kagune would grab onto All Might's arms and start pulling his arms away, almost as though All Might was about to receive a hug. This is when Izuku would bite into his weak spot, as he would start using all of his force, All Might coughing out more and more blood by the second, realizing that he was about to lose, when suddenly Izuku would have teardrops falling from his eyes, his consciousness trying to take back over, realizing that in this moment he was killing All Might. Everything inside of his being would scream at him to stop, but his body was moving. It was so hard to resist the commands, and this is when Kurogiri would get involved, opening a portal, making it that much more difficult for All Might to escape, leaving Todoroki and Bakugo to simply watch on until Bakugo would finally rush towards him, blasting an explosion at Kurogiri and telling him to stay out of it. All the while Todoroki would freeze Izuku's abdomen, causing it all to shatter as it would regen in an instant, and he would leap backwards like a cat having dodged a snake bite. It's at this point that All Might, getting back up weakly, holding at his injury, would say, "Thank you, young man," as we would then see Izuku standing before All Might shaking, his face contorting as one of his eyes would change back to normal, and Izuku would scream out, "Help me!" This would shock All Might, who can see that that's clearly a person in need in there. Not knowing what to do, before Izuku would lunge towards the direction of All Might, fist clashing against his as Izuku's arm would shatter under the pressure. But as it would heal almost instantly, Izuku's Kagune would wrap around the arm of All Might, twisting it as he would break it before stabbing his Kagune into 3 different spots of All Might narrowly having avoided his head from getting crushed in that second, as Bakugo would be having a life crisis right now, muttering the name Deku. It's here that as Izuku would be about to land the finishing blow on All Might, Shigaraki gloating about the regeneration Kagune quirk and the enhanced senses that Izuku's strike would miss, him causing it to divert, Izuku's arms and body starting to literally contort, him fighting back with everything he has, his other eye changing back to normal, that Izuku would scream, "Let me go!" Memories of his childhood flashing through his mind, all those videos of All Might he had watched that would brighten his day, the memorabilia, his mother, his hero, that Izuku would finally snap out of it, now falling completely unconscious, as Shigaraki would scream out, "No, no, no! This wasn't supposed to happen! Kurogiri! Get me out of here!" The heroes watching as a pissed off Shigaraki would stare at Izuku, writhing at the mouth, just wanting to decay him instantly, but knowing that the symbol of peace, All Might, was standing there, weakened as ever, but standing there would be more than enough of a deterrent. The villains fading away as All Might would stand over the body of Izuku, unaware of what to do. What had just happened, he would think. But as Bakugo would get back up, he would walk over towards the body, moving the hair out of the face, recognizing the freckles, the eyes that were now back to normal, and even the white hair. He would fall on top of the chest of Izuku as tears would pour out of his face, and he would apologize profusely, saying he's sorry, so sorry. It's at this point that All Might would ask what he's so sorry about, but Bakugo, completely unable to put anything into words, would just kind of go silent, him unable to say anything from the experience that had honestly just traumatized him. Because keep in mind, this whole time Bakugo had been keeping inside a secret that he had killed somebody, hadn't reported it to anybody, and when Izuku's mother called the Mitsuki household, Bakugo would have literally have said he has no idea, so the shame and the guilt would have been eating at him this whole time, him almost unable to bear with himself, and now seeing Izuku in this state, he would feel even worse. It's at this point that Izuku, having been captured by the police, would then be taken into custody, All Might requesting that once he recovers from his injuries, he would speak to the boy. As 3 days would pass, and as All Might would be in his big All Might form, granted bandages, one of his arms literally in a casting, as it was literally, it was torn to shreds, bro, I can't lie. He would walk over towards the now kind of conscious Izuku, who would be sitting in front of him looking downcast the whole time, that All Might would ask, "What's your name?" And Izuku would say, "My name is Izuku Midoriya." All Might asking if he knew what he was doing at the USJ, Izuku speaking softly, saying that he did, but he couldn't control it. There were orders commanding him to do it. Tears would start flowing out from his eyes as he would look at his hand and say, "I'm a damn freak. I wanted a quirk so bad I lunged off that building and now I'm turned into a monster. And I'm so damn hungry," Izuku would say, as he would place his hands over his head, screaming out, "I'm so hungry, All Might. I'm so hungry." All Might asking what he's talking about before Izuku would tell him to get out of the room right now. All Might saying why, as Izuku would scream, "Get out!" All Might doing just that as Izuku would start recoiling on the ground, saying he's so hungry. One of his eyes would turn back to black, red pupil now returning, as All Might would question what's going on. This is when Detective Sukauchi would ask through the intercoms, "What's wrong?" Izuku telling him that he's starving. Sukauchi bringing in a meal for Izuku, with Izuku attempting to eat it but spitting it out almost instantly, beginning to quite literally throw up. Izuku's eyes would widen as he would realize that that doctor must have done something to him, because that somehow managed to taste like dog feces or something. And as Izuku would sit there on the ground, stomach hurting at this moment, him just wanting to eat something so badly, he would be asked a question, "What are you hungry for?" This is when Izuku would gulp and flat out just say it, "Human flesh." This would shock everybody in the other room, All Might understanding clearly now why Izuku wanted him to leave. This is when All Might would move Sukauchi aside, asking a question. "Did you ever feel an inclination to eat human flesh prior to your time with the League of Villains?" And Izuku would say no, never, explaining in a monotone expression that the doctor who had performed countless experiments on him gave him quirk factors, and one of them most likely gave him the craving for flesh. All Might hearing this would tighten his fist, pissed that the villains would do something like that to a kid, and on top of that, the corpse of one. He would ask Izuku if he knows who was the head of this operation, having a sneaking suspicion that All For One was behind it. Izuku saying that the memories are hazy, but he remembers a man with a suit and a mask who managed to take him down like it was child's play. And as All Might would hear that, it would confirm all of his suspicions. He would say to Sukauchi that All For One is on the move once again. And as Izuku would remain inside of the room, this is when Izuku would ask a question. "Are you gonna put me down?" The room staying silent for a second before All Might would say that they won't, explaining that worst case scenario, Izuku will be placed in Tartarus, but best case, which is what he's hoping for, they're gonna do everything within their power to make sure Izuku can return to his normal life, if of course that's what he wanted. Izuku now could feel tears pouring from his eyes as he would say thank you, and his stomach would start growling. This is when All Might, turning to Sukauchi, would say that the kid doesn't deserve to starve to death just because of the error experiments placed on him, and Sukauchi would say that they can't just give him human flesh. They would have to either give him somebody alive or give him a dead corpse. And All Might, hearing that, understanding that that's just not possible, would look down. Dr. Sukauchi putting a hand on All Might's shoulder, telling him that they'll figure this out, giving Izuku multiple different things to eat, and eventually giving him a coffee. Pure black coffee. As Izuku would drink it, remembering back when he had used to hate coffee, Izuku would strangely enough feel an ever so slight feeling of satiation, since the coffee would have actually contained RC cells, or at least a very minuscule amount of it. This would hold Izuku off long enough for Sukauchi to eventually pull some strings and see to it that within the week, Izuku could potentially be given some real food, at least for his new quirk factors. Then, as time would come and go and more questions would be asked for Izuku, the doctors and police would eventually connect the dots, the experiments, the augmentations, everything would come clear, and they would understand that Izuku is a lot of things, but a threat is not one of them. So, Principal Nezu decided to take Izuku under his wing, seeing the determination to use these powers for good and not to let these new abilities and monstrous factor define him. Nezu would accept him into UA, telling him that very soon, after the sports festival, Izuku will be integrated into Class 1A, alongside the only teacher that could potentially hold him back, Eraserhead. Izuku would be more than grateful for the opportunity, bawling his eyes out. Now, after having consumed some flesh from a criminal who was put on death row, Izuku would have retained a semblance of his previous personality, and the true nature of Izuku would come out, a fearful, shy, unconfident, unsure of himself kid. This would lead Nezu to telling Izuku that everything will be great, and that once Izuku can control these quirk factors within himself, he will be an incredible hero. After all, he went toe-to-toe with All Might. Izuku would smile, saying that he did, remembering that before then feeling bad because he remembered the blows he landed on All Might, and though he could heal, All Might couldn't. And though Izuku would have offered hundreds of apologies for All Might, he still couldn't feel horrible about what he had done to his once greatest idol. However, with time passing, eventually the sports festival would come and go, and in this timeline, Todoroki would be the winner of everything, considering the fact that with no Izuku, that means that Todoroki won't necessarily be off of his game, and so, if absolutely necessary, I can see him actually using his fire side in order to defeat Bakugo. With that being the case, eventually the students would return back to class, and on that day, Izuku would walk inside alongside Aizawa, him saying, "Alright class, settle down. Today we have a new student." Everybody seeing him and being on edge. "Wait, isn't that the Nomu that fought against All Might?" The class would all simultaneously say, except Bakugo, Aizawa holding a hand out as if to signal to shut up, as he would explain, "Yes, you're all correct. Izuku was nomified and was given multiple quirks via experimentation, but that doesn't mean that the experiments necessarily define him. During that battle that he had against All Might, he nearly did kill the symbol of peace, but Izuku managed to fight back and regain control, and thanks to that, we were able to discover much information about the League of Villains. Information that I can't disclose to you guys at the moment, but information that will be very viable in the foreseeable future." The entirety of the class would sit silently, as they would be expecting Izuku's voice to ring out just like it had in the USJ, but no, Izuku would say, "It's nice to meet you all. My name is Izuku Midoriya." Everybody being like, "He's so calm." This is when Aizawa would signal towards Izuku, telling him to sit next to Monoma, as Monoma would turn towards Deku, going, "So, you got multiple quirks, do ya? Mind if I..." Reaching his hand out and grabbing hold of Izuku, but due to the fact that he couldn't copy all those quirks at once and wasn't able to copy the thing that Dr. Ujiko did, it would be a dud. Monoma would think, "Oh man." As Izuku would smile at him, saying that he just attempted to copy his quirk, didn't he? He would ask in a nice way, but very shy, "Did it work?" Monoma saying, "No, of course it didn't." Izuku feeling bad, apologizing for that, before kind of just remaining quiet, as Mineta would say, "So, you're throng with All Might, I guess. How does that feel?" Izuku saying that he hasn't really thought about it like that, since after all, the only reason that he was quote-unquote stronger than All Might was because he was fighting like a monster, but he doesn't think he's ever gonna fight like that when he actually has the chance to save people, stunning Mineta and the rest of the class. This is when they would ask, "So why are you..." As Aizawa would cut them off saying, "We're in class. If you guys want to speak to the boy, you can wait till lunch period." Izuku kind of nodding, apologizing as class would go on. This is when eventually, as the day would end, Izuku would be sitting down at the lunch table. A bunch of the people that were curious about Izuku's story would go over towards his table and begin asking him questions. Izuku answering everything to the best of his abilities, for some questions not really telling them the truth, but for others explaining the true story. He wouldn't let in on the fact that Bakugo was the reason he jumped off, but he would disclose the fact that he was kidnapped and from that point forward experimented on. And everybody would be like, "That's so cool." Izuku kind of staying quiet, remembering the pain that he felt, because mind you, he may have regeneration, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't feel pain. So Izuku having a contorted face would suddenly make everybody around him realize that they were starting to make him a bit uncomfortable, and as they would get scared backing up, they would say they're sorry. Izuku saying that they shouldn't be afraid of him, and that he's been working really hard to keep his power under check, shooting out his Kagune saying, "See?" Everybody watching, Izuku saying that he promises he will never harm a single hair on their head. Everybody now breathing easy, as Bakugo would walk over towards Izuku and ask him if he's really okay. Izuku nodding, not staring at Bakugo with eyes of hate or anything, so as Bakugo would see this, he would walk away silently. Izuku wondering what's up with Kachan, why is he acting so mellow towards him for some reason. Izuku not really registering that Bakugo low-key was still kind of feeling bad about the fact that everything that happened to Izuku was all his fault. And yeah, getting a quirk or not getting a quirk aside, Izuku went through hell and back, and it was all because of a stupid comment he had made. Izuku would beat himself up sitting alone at a lunch table, Kirishima wanting to talk to him but him saying, "Get lost, red hair!" Kirishima walking away being like, "Geez man, what's got you on edge today?" Bakugo simply chewing on his food and not saying anything. This kind of behavior would kind of go on for a couple of days, or at least until the week would be up when everybody would finally have to choose their internships. Izuku in this timeline not actually going on one, because instead of choosing to do something like that, Izuku would actually spend his time with Nezu and the UA faculty trying to hone his quirk and make sure that Izuku doesn't have any incidents that he goes crazy. The UA staff would notice one thing during this time period though, and that would be that Izuku seems to hold back a lot. Significantly actually, because the kind of showings that he was using at the USJ was not even half of the stuff he was doing. His fighting style was way more docile and didn't have the it had before. This would lead Aizawa to ask Izuku what's wrong. Izuku admitting that honestly, he knows he's holding back, but he feels like he can't use all of his power. Explaining that he's scared. What if he loses it? What if he kills someone? Aizawa would place his hand on his shoulder telling him that that's exactly why they're training. Izuku looking at his mentor and nodding, saying that he'll try to work on it but he can't make any promises. Aizawa saying not to worry, that after all, they have 3 years to work on that. And so, Izuku nodding, he would continue his training. Eventually though, the news would come to everybody that their class rep Tensei Ida was dead. Due to no intervention from Izuku in this timeline and no one-for-all user leading Gran Torino to Hosu, this means that not only would there be more damage, but Tenya Ida would be a casualty in the incident. And with that being the case, this would mean a lot of scrutiny for UA, because for a month straight, the school would essentially have a period in time in which they had to shut down and they had to suspend action, due to the fact that for the second time in UA's history, a student has died in action. So with these acts being put into question for UA, they would be forced for a temporary suspension, which Izuku would spend his time actually using it to his benefit, training and using his quirk, and developing a much different fighting style with his Kagune. Way less aggressive, and using his tentacles more so like an octopus for mobility and for allowing him to spin into the air. He refuses to use them as much for offensive purposes just because Izuku's still scared of what he can do, but Izuku has definitely managed to take note of his incredible sensory capabilities, the healing, the speed, and even the super strength. The teacher's noting one thing: Izuku goes way harder when he's facing off against robots, things that he knows have no life, but when he's facing something like Dupliman's clones, which I think is the bro's name, Izuku does not try half as hard, because he still has that mental block of being unable to use his quirk to its fullest abilities. So by the time that UA would be back on in a month, Izuku would have made great strides in his quirk usage. But enough of that. Eventually, with the students returning back to UA, we would zoom into Aizawa, who would ask the question of what the students have been up to this whole time. Everybody would say that they've been using this time to take their own training, having known that the school would come back online, grieving as well as locking back in for the next semester. There actually being 2 less characters in the class, in Koji Koda and Minoru Mineta, the 2 of them having given up on their hero career after realizing that this is serious, they could actually die on the field. So with 2 less classmates now, Aizawa would address the situation. People getting a little saddened before saying that now they have to be working twice as hard, seeing as if they want to keep Ida's memory alive, they're going to need to do even more. This is when Aizawa would say, "And you're absolutely right, which is why we're going to be holding the final exams that you were supposed to take a month ago. And given the fact that you had so much time to study, I wanted to give you the test today. But Nezu decided otherwise, so all of you will be having until Friday to study for your exam. Everybody freaking out, Momo not as much, like all the smart people not really freaking out because they did study, but all the normal people would be like, crap, I didn't think this would come so soon. As everybody would prepare themselves for the final exam, Izuku being more than prepared, as the day of the exam would come and go. With him passing, Izuku would watch on as his classmates would face off against the teachers. Izuku curious to see who he's gonna face off against, until suddenly, All Might would land before him. Izuku seeing the tall hulking man and beginning to feel a sensation of dread. Nezu, as expected, would tell Izuku to calm down and that this is his test for a reason. It's a hurdle to show if Izuku is willing to actually use his powers, and since they knew the thing that he was most traumatized by was All Might, they figured they would use him. This is when Izuku would then realize he needs a teammate, and none other than Katsuki Bakugo would be waiting, who would say nothing to Izuku, simply kind of nodding, as Izuku and Bakugo would make their way towards the waiting area and both of them would think of a plan. Izuku would walk over towards Bakugo saying, I was thinking that we could try to escape together, but Bakugo would simply say nothing, eventually breaking the silence with, sorry. Izuku asking, what? As Bakugo would say, I'm sorry, damn it! Do you need me to yell it at you? Izuku looking at his childhood friend who would apologize, now voice breaking as he would say he's so sorry, confessing to the fact that it was all his fault, the fact that Izuku was now a freak of nature, the fact that Izuku now has to eat human flesh, the fact that Deku went through all those horrible experimentations, and the fact that on top of everything else he lied to everybody about what had happened. He lied to his mother when she asked if he knew where he was, he lied to the school when they asked if he knew anything about Izuku's disappearance. He lied to the world when he said he was a hero. Izuku, hearing this, being taken aback, would say, Bakugo, as Bakugo would say that he's sorry, tears completely welling up in his eyes as he would ask Izuku for his forgiveness, literally bowing down. Izuku looking at Bakugo and telling him that he never held a grudge, that he made a stupid mistake, and he regretted his action the moment he leaped off the roof. But there was no turning back. At least he thought. This is when he would go on to explain that at first, he didn't know how to feel about everything and he truly did believe himself a monster, but with more time passing and him understanding that thanks to that, now he has a quirk and he's gonna be able to save people's lives, his life was given purpose. He was able to help the heroes out in their efforts to potentially track down and take down All For One. Thanks to Bakugo, but Bakugo would cut him off. He would say, thanks to me, you went through hell and back, and that's the truth, Deku. So even if you say you'll forgive me, I'm not gonna stop trying to make it up to you even if it takes me the rest of my life. Izuku looking at Bakugo and nodding before telling him that he could start by helping him enact his plan. And Bakugo would nod, although not wanting to take this path, he would understand that if that's what Deku wanted, he would help him in his endeavor. So, as soon as the match would begin, Izuku and Bakugo would rush their way towards the exit, Bakugo eventually being cut off by All Might, who would punch him into a building. Izuku, now seeing All Might, would freeze up, completely unable to move as All Might would punch him into a building 10 times harder. All Might being sent crashing into it would have his limbs contort, arm completely busted as they would all spin back into place and Izuku would get back up, Kagune protruding from his back as he would lunge towards the direction of the exit, All Might throwing a super powered blow that would send wind pressure that would send Deku flying back, although while Bakugo would lunge at All Might, using his gauntlet to shoot a massive explosion in his face. All Might would feel absolutely nothing from this but a sting, as he would then grab onto the arm of Bakugo and break it, or like fracture it, slamming him onto the ground like Loki did to Hulk did to Loki. As simultaneously on the other side of the battlefield, Izuku would be about to cross the finish line, All Might punching him once again, Izuku holding out his guard, practically refusing to fight. All Might was saying, "What's wrong, hero? Aren't you going to take down the enemy standing before you?" Izuku freezing up, unable to move, remembering the blood trickling from All Might's mouth, and in a refusal to do that to him again, Izuku would simply take the punishment from All Might telling him to defeat him. He's a villain. He needs to do this to save lives. But Izuku would just take blow after blow after blow, being caved into a building, blood beginning to cough out as he would simply regenerate once again. And as the time would finally end and All Might would finish the beating, All Might would help Izuku up, apologizing, saying that he failed. Izuku looking down at the ground and saying that he knows, that he doesn't have to remind him, as All Might looking at his student would tell him that what happened at the USJ wasn't his fault, and he doesn't have to live as though he was responsible for the injuries. Saying that though his quirk can be dangerous if used improperly, if Izuku refines it and uses it in such a way that makes the quirk heroic, Izuku can use whatever quirk it is and become the greatest hero he can with it. But Izuku, not saying anything, would simply walk away, now feeling embarrassed and ashamed. He would leave the area not really knowing exactly how to feel, as after failing, Izuku and Bakugo would be put in the extra courses that all failures had to take. So when they would go to the forest training camp arc, Izuku would have just that much more work than he would in the original. But that's getting a bit ahead of myself. When Izuku and the rest of the class would arrive at the forest training camp, this is when all of them would be introduced to Mandalay, shortly after being introduced to mud monsters. Where thanks to the fact that Izuku was now facing off against inanimate objects, Izuku was actually capable of using his Kagune at 60%, landing some devastating blows. The rest of the class noting how that's more like the Izuku that they remember. But instead of getting the reaction that they had hoped, Izuku would wince at that, completely stopping his onslaught with his Kagune. Them all finally making their way to the camp, where Izuku would kind of just be docile the entire time, not really using his quirk to the fullest effect as he possibly could, as eventually the day would come where the League of Villains would attack and the Vanguard Action Squad would be on the move. With the students finally returning to camp, this is when Izuku would be informed how his school life was going to be since he had, well, failed. And with that being said, he would be put in the same room as Kirishima, Sato, and the rest of Class 1B's rejects. With this taking place, Izuku would spend a majority of his time taking extracurricular courses, teaching him how he should act as a hero, how he should handle different situations as a hero, how working together alongside other heroes you may not like is a more common thing than they would think, and many other things among that. Izuku's actual training would more so be spent with him using his Kagune to launch small attacks towards the golems that Mandalay would be able to create for him, and Izuku would enjoy this type of training, dealing devastating blows towards these golems that can't feel anything, though at Izuku's request, his training would be held a bit distant from the others, considering the fact that he didn't want them to think of him as a monster, but to see him as who he wants to be. Izuku Midoriya, still not having accepted the fact that he's no longer the same boy he once was. He's different now, and for the better or for the worse, that's just a fact. As more and more time would pass, eventually they would find themselves on the 4th day of their training, all preparing a feast to eat, although while Izuku's stomach would be grumbling. It's at this point that as Izuku would be cutting up some vegetables for his classmates to enjoy their curry, Izuku would notice that one particular person was gone from the camp, and tracking Koda using his enhanced senses, Izuku would find him towards the side of a mountain. Koda now crying, remembering his parents, wondering why they had to be heroes. This is when this would all be interrupted by Izuku, who would say, "Hey, are you?" Koda cutting him off though and saying, "Get lost! I don't need anybody's sympathy!" as he would wipe his tears away, telling him to get! But Izuku, placing the plate of curry down by the boy whose stomach was grumbling, he would tell him that he needs to eat or he'll go hungry. He would say that he knows what that feels like all too well. Izuku's stomach grumbling in that moment, as Izuku would take a few more steps towards Koda, who now aiming his hands at Izuku would shoot water at him. But Izuku would sit down next to him saying, "You know, that water quirk of yours might hurt others, but I can just regenerate from the damage. Why don't you try talking to someone? Maybe it won't fix things, but it could help." Koda hearing that would finally start bawling out, telling Izuku the truth, how his parents were killed by a villain, and how his parents were the greatest heroes, the water hose duo. Izuku hearing that would remember the incident, saying that he had actually heard of the water hose heroes, and he had kept up with a lot of their rescue operations they had taken part of. Koda would say if they weren't heroes, they'd still be around. I don't know why they were out there defending others when they should have been taking care of me. Izuku kind of just looking up at the sky as he would be about to tell something to Kota when suddenly the sounds of footsteps would grow near and a raspy voice of Muscular would echo out. Guess it's my lucky day. Just my luck that I would happen to run into not only the target, but a little brat that I get to rip piece by piece. Izuku, hearing that, returned to see the hulking man now standing before him, wondering what he was doing here. Yue's defenses should have Muscular cutting him off by punching at the ground, causing it to shake, and Kota to nearly actually fall off the edge of the cliff. Izuku, using his arm, would grab Kota, putting him towards the edge of the ledge and saying, "Run!" It's here that Izuku would be punched square in the side of the ribs by Muscular, who would scream out, "Come on! I've heard a heck of a lot about your strength. Supposedly, you're the one who was gonna kill All Might, right?" Izuku's body now being sent crashing into the mountainside, his arms and legs healing almost instantly. Muscular saying, "Fascinating. So it's true, you have an incredible regeneration quirk, but let's just see how well that holds up against muscles." Muscular beginning to transform, coating his entire body in a thick sheet of muscle fibers. As he would then go to throw another punch towards the edge of the cliff, Izuku jumping out of the way and saying, "Kota, you need to go now!" But Kota, completely unable to move, he would simply point his finger out at Muscular going, "It's him." Izuku simply screaming out, "Get the heck out of here, Kota!" Kota looking back towards Izuku and frozen in fear, he would scream out, "You're the guy who killed the water hose heroes, aren't ya?" As Muscular would cry out, "Huh? The water hose heroes, eh? Yeah, I think I remember killing those guys. They're actually the ones who gave me this eye injury." Kota looking at the man, who would say it was a lot of fun, before Izuku lunging towards him, fist reeled back, would throw a blow at Muscular that Muscular would grab by his arm before twisting it, basically tearing his arm off nearly like it was hanging on by threads, and slamming Izuku onto the ground. Izuku would cough out some blood, his arm regenerating as he would go for a leg sweep, but the leg sweep would do nothing, and it's at this point that Izuku would use his Kagune as it would extend out from his back and it would begin spinning, then wrapping itself around Muscular as it would attempt to crush him to take him out as swiftly as possible. However, Muscular's muscle fibers would expand all the more, him saying, "Damn kid, didn't really think I was going all out at first, did ya?" As his muscle fibers would tear off the Kagune, completely unable to restrain him, Izuku unable to actually use his full power, he would then be flung towards the other side of the cliff, Muscular grabbing onto the kid and saying, "Where's that great power of yours I heard so much about? Come on kid, if you don't show it, this kid's gonna die." Izuku would scream out, "No, you can't!" As Muscular would say, 3, 2, and then kill the kid before even getting to 1, not even actually giving Izuku the chance to use his true powers. And as Izuku would watch the neck of Kota being snapped in that moment, something inside of Izuku would change, as he would stare at the dead body of Kota now on the ground, Muscular screaming out, "There, now you don't have to worry about defending the kid, and we can go all out on this mountain cliff. One of us is gonna walk away, and one of us is gonna die." Izuku looking back towards Kota's body on the ground, blood pouring out from his mouth, nose, and even eardrums. As one of Izuku's eyes would turn dark black with red pupils, Izuku would stare up at Muscular as he would say, "You're dead." It's at this point that Izuku would lunge at Muscular with maximum speed, Muscular throwing a hulking punch at the ground which would shatter it, but Izuku appearing right behind Muscular would then extend his Kagune to pierce into his side. This attack wouldn't go through all the way, however, as Muscular would have just enough time to react, swinging his arm backwards. However, Izuku propelling himself up into the air, using his Kagune and the weight distribution of Muscular, he would then slam him into the edge of the cliff. Muscular screaming out, "Now that's more like it, kid! You keep entertaining me like this, and we might just have a fight on our hands," as Izuku's Kagune would extend and then pierce into the body of Muscular, who grabbing it by all 4 limbs would then throw Izuku nearly off the edge of the cliff. However, this is when Izuku's Kagune, extending further than it ever has before, would latch onto the mountainside, flinging himself back upwards as spinning mid-air, He would then fly at Muscular, using his Kagune to latch onto every limb of Muscular, holding them in place, Muscular smiling, going, "That's more," before suddenly Izuku would headbutt him in the mouth, shattering his teeth and messing up his jaw in one blow, before then kneeing him in the stomach and proceeding to punch and punch and punch and punch, and as though Muscular would try to free himself from the grip of the Kagune, Izuku would be so enraged that the strength of it would be flowing at like 200%, his maximum output being shattered by the rage that Izuku was feeling. And as the punches would start piling on, the muscle fibers would start turning purple, clearly bruising, Muscular going, "Ugh, damn it, kid, this isn't how the fight's supposed to go," making one final attempt to hit at Izuku and break free. However, this is when Izuku would break both of Muscular's arms, spinning them the opposite direction, Muscular crying out, "Ah!" as a twisted smile would appear on Izuku's face and he would say, "This is what you wanted, wasn't it?" before kicking Muscular square in the family jewels, causing him to fall to his knees as his Kagune would spin and cut Muscular's head clean off. As Muscular's head would roll off to the ground, blood pouring out, Izuku would consume his flesh, muscle fibers having gone back into Muscular's body, with Izuku's heartbeat palpitating 2 times faster than usual, him eating and actually getting somewhat of a power-up from this. And with Izuku recognizing that if he was attacked, it's a likely possibility others will be as well, he would leap off the mountain cliff, landing on the ground, both of his legs breaking instantly before healing, as Izuku using his Kagune to whip tree branch to tree branch, Izuku would eventually find himself with Bakugo and Todoroki, using his Kagune to fly at the direction of Moonfish, who attempting to use his teeth as offensive weapons to shatter Izuku. This is when Izuku's Kagune would pierce into the stomach of Moonfish, having left him in a near-death state before flying towards him and screaming, "You like flesh so much? Well, let's see how yours tastes!" before biting onto Moonfish's neck and chewing off a significant portion of Moonfish. Moonfish would be left on the ground bleeding, as Todoroki and Bakugo would both stare at Izuku, Todoroki high on guard, and Bakugo with an expression of shock on his face. But Izuku wouldn't mind that at the moment. He would simply turn towards them and say, "Let's go. We need to save the rest of our classmates. We can deal with this later." As all of them would make their way through the forest and eventually find Tokiyami and Dupliarms, Todoroki using his flame quirk to cause Tokiyami's dark shadow to calm down, as they eventually would make their way towards Uraraka and Sue, where it's here that Izuku, noting that Bakugo had disappeared via not sensing his presence thanks to his quirks, he would go on the chase after Mr. Compress, screaming out, "Give him back!" Kagune extending, latching onto tree branch to tree branch, closing in on the man, who would have no other choice but to toss the marbles directly at the direction of Dabi, who, catching both of them and smirking, would say, "Checkmate." But as he would utter those words, Izuku would grab Mr. Compress by the neck, aiming his Kagune at Mr. Compress's stomach, saying that unless he lets them go, this one dies. Dabi would give him a look of shock before saying, "You don't have it in you, hero. There's no way you could." But Izuku would start piercing him in the stomach, as Twice, who was actually echoing that sentiment, going, "There's no way he'll do it," would suddenly lunge at Dabi, grabbing the marbles and saying they'll do it. But that would have been exactly what Deku was hoping for, because in an instant, Izuku would pierce into the stomach of Mr. Compress, killing him, before lunging towards the direction of the villain's portal, spinning his Kagune to make himself move even faster mid-air, and flying in through the portal with Dabi. It's now that we would see Dabi, Toga, Spinner, Magma, and Shigaraki all in one room, Izuku having a devilish grin on his face as he would shoot his Kagune towards the direction of Dabi, the one who would question his intentions. However, Dabi aiming his hands out would shoot a blaze of cremation flames at Izuku, which in an instant would force him to shoot backwards, skin beginning to char as Izuku's anger would rise in that moment. His Kagune would extend outwards as, flying towards the direction of Dabi's appendix, he would pierce straight through it, before then sending another one to stab him straight through the throat. Dabi, not having expected such a devastating first shot, would slump to the ground, blood pouring out of him as his body would start to literally overheat, it preparing itself to self-explode as Shigaraki, staring at the direction of Izuku, who now licking his lips and looking at the corpse of the Dabi, who is about to blow at any second now, would cry out, "Damn you, hero!" Rushing towards him in an attempt to decay him, Izuku grabbing him by his arms and slamming them to the ground, causing him to be in like a girl pusher position as Izuku would kick Shigaraki square to the jaw, grabbing him by his face and squeezing his cheeks, Kagune fully extended towards the direction of the remaining villains, them all completely still, knowing that if they do anything, they could die. That is, until Magma, unwilling to let Shigaraki die, would use his magnetism quirk to pull Deku towards him, leaving just enough time for a black sludgy portal to appear and suck Izuku out of that room. The next thing Izuku would know, he would be inside of the same room that he was experimented on. Countless green vats of liquid around him as he would see the man of the person who had taken him down for the first time. All for one. Izuku would smile, looking at All for One as he would say, "It's just too perfect. I get to kill countless of your pawns, then I get to kill the doctor, and I finally get to you." All for One telling him that he's a fool if he believes that a simple Nomu has the power to defeat him, who has hundreds of quirks. Izuku chuckling before telling him that he's not just any Nomu, Kagune now extended, fiercer than ever before. Since now Izuku has the added benefit of having his analytical mind powering his every attack. Because remember, the first time Izuku had fought All for One, he was completely feral. The only thing that was controlling his body was rage. But now Izuku's working with a combination of anger and deadly battle tactics that Izuku had been working on during his time with the heroes. It's at this point that Izuku, using his Kagune to extend it at the doctor, would have his attack stopped by All for One, who would call him a fool, having placed a barrier. Izuku lunging towards his direction, stopping just short as All for One would shoot a wind-pressured blast at him, Izuku stabbing his Kagune into the ground to keep his footing before lunging up at the sky, or more specifically roof, and then lunging downwards at full force against All for One, using his Kagune to defend himself from any attack All for One could send at him. It's in this moment that Izuku's Kagune, extending 3 limbs outward, would pierce towards the direction of All for One, all in different directions, having extended way further than what All for One thought, and as All for One would create a barrier, some holes would protrude, Izuku's attack nicking All for One and drawing some blood. This would leave Izuku to smirk, as suddenly, All for One, using a combination of like 17 quirks, would send Deku flying back at the wall, crashing into the ground, multiple bones breaking, as Izuku would get up quickly before the next attack would come, and running around the room as he would mock All for One, telling him that if he wants to put him down, he's gonna have to try harder than that. All for One smiling before sending an attack far more powerful this time, and telling the doctor that he's sorry, but he's gonna have to break his new toy. The attack completely eradicating Izuku's ribcage, like 30% of his body would have been disappeared at that point, as Izuku screaming out, "Ugh!" would then get covered behind a metal vat. All for One, unwilling to attack, would give Izuku the precious second he needed to heal. Izuku throwing his Kagune out towards the left before rushing out towards the right, All for One saying he's predictable, as Izuku would say he knows. Then, with All for One being distracted, he would extend one of his Kagune, stabbing into the body of All for One, as blood would begin to be coughed out of the man's mask, and Izuku, finally now within range, would use his Kagune to wrap around All for One in an instant, coiling him like a snake, as Izuku approaches, giving him no time to think or breathe, bashing both fists on All for One's head. This would cause the man's mask to shatter, all the while both of his eardrums would be echoing in his head. Izuku, well aware of the effects this could have on somebody, he would then grab a piece of rubble he was hiding in his back pocket before stabbing it through the jaw of All for One and it piercing through his skull. This is when the doctor, now completely shocked at the fact that Izuku had managed to kill the Demon Lord, would begin retreating, running away screaming, "I've got to get out of here!" Izuku laughing as he would say, "Run, run while you still can!" Kagune then beginning to pierce All For One in multiple sections of his body, all the while Izuku would be tearing into his flesh, consuming All For One. Izuku smirking and saying that he shouldn't have let his guard down. All For One coughing out blood, attempting to use a last-ditch effort to destroy Deku. He would fail, a mouth beam being shot at Izuku, which he would predict due to his heightened senses. And once All For One's body would stop moving, and most of it would have actually been consumed, starting with his head, Izuku would then rush towards the direction of the Nomu. 12 Nomus all trying to stop him, Izuku using his Kagune to tear into their skulls, rip their necks off, rip their arms off, tear their legs out, and even drive his Kagune into their hearts. Izuku would rampage, taking advantage of the knowledge that he knows that if you aim for a Nomu's brain, at least the previous model, they would die. He would eventually catch up to the doctor, who now being cornered would scream out, "No, please, stay away!" But as Izuku would slowly walk towards the doctor would smirk, having planned for this moment. Having summoned a high-end Nomu as it would crash into Deku's body, slamming him in the wall, punching him repeatedly in the face, to which Izuku would simply laugh, screaming out to enjoy this last attack, because after this, he's gonna tear into his flesh, just like as his Kagune would pierce into the back of the Nomu, it's screeching out, Izuku using his Kagune to wrap around the body of the Nomu, grabbing him by all 4 limbs before using his legs to kick out, before he would then rip off all of its arms and legs, and then pierce the Nomu square through the skull, using his patented move to destroy the Nomu's head. However, the Nomu wouldn't be taken down, and with Izuku recognizing that this Nomu's healing factor might just be as good as his, Izuku would go crazy, using his Kagune to slaughter every little bit in peace, dragging the Nomu throughout the building, all the while he would be chasing behind the doctor, until eventually Izuku would start eating at the Nomu itself, spitting out, calling it disgusting, as the Nomu would finally stop regenerating. It was done. And with Izuku now staring at the doctor, he would now walk slowly towards it once again, asking what other move he has now. Kagune extending and grabbing the doctor by the leg as he would slowly drag it away towards a dark room, where Izuku would begin inflicting every single kind of torture that the doctor had given to him. The doctor having died after the 5th one, but since Izuku was having so much fun, he simply kept toying with the man's corpse. And with the doctor now dead, Izuku would gnaw at him, eating at every piece of the doctor's flesh as though it was a delicacy, before wiping the blood off of his face and saying, "Thanks, doctor." But that, ladies and gentlemen, is where I'm gonna be ending this one off. Let me know what you guys thought about that one down below in the comments, seeing as I'm pretty excited to see your guys' takes from what you guys thought about this video, because it's honestly a lot different than the ones that I typically do. But truth be told, I had a lot of fun. I never thought I would enjoy doing a Tokyo Ghoul Deku as much as I actually did. So let me know down below what your suggestions and thoughts are. And once again, shout out to the person who commissioned this video. But with that said, I'll catch y'all. Peace.
Hey, you made it to the end of the video! Like it or die! That wasn't the line, Kachan! Whatever!